Off the top of your head, can you name how many platforms you have a presence on? So don't count the ones where you've made a profile just for the sole purpose of purchasing something or claiming a coupon. I mean the platforms where you actively use your account to post and curate content of your own. Think of what you upload to Instagram. Are there photos of your food, photos with family, monthly photo dumps? Now think about the statuses you post on Facebook. Significant life updates, so family in another state know what's going on in your life. Maybe you complain about establishments and you post viral content. What about Twitter, also now known as X? Do you share your hottest takes and your most unhinged memes? Maybe you're starting to see what I'm getting at. Each of these platforms are, especially now, not so different from one another. They all host media, they all encourage user generated content, and they all establish interpersonal connection among users. But even with their similarities, each of these platforms inspires totally different engagements from us, the users, without us even realizing it. I'm Aislinn, and this is Season 1, Episode 1 of the Theory and Tangents podcast. Before we jump straight into things, I just want to say that I know podcasts are meant to be where we pitch our original shower thoughts to the world. I know. But this concept about different platforms informing the way we behave, I acknowledge is not a new idea. So in 1964, a Canadian philosopher proposed that a medium affects its society not because of the content it delivers, but by its own characteristics. The philosopher's name was Marshall McLuhan, and he coined the phrase, "the medium is the message," which is still widely quoted and studied in the communication field today. But what does that actually mean? And who was this guy? Born in Alberta, Canada in 1911, Marshall McLuhan grew up in Winnipeg and started out studying English literature. He was obsessed with language, poetry, and how stories shape culture. Eventually, he went to Cambridge in England for grad school, where he studied not just literature, but also the way different forms of writing and communication evolved over time. When he came back to Canada, he taught at the University of Toronto. Now, his students described him as an eccentric, fast talking professor who drew these wild connections between technology, art, and culture. So it really just sounds like he's someone that we would love to have on this podcast. And he was always asking, how does the form of communication change the way we think? Not just the words used, but the container they come in. So, coming back to the 60s, this was a time, kind of like current times, if you think about it, when a lot of technological change was happening. And it was happening really fast, too. Television was just becoming the dominant form of entertainment. Pocket sized radios could be found on every teenager, and computers were moving out of research labs and into mainstream businesses. Society was literally buzzing with new ways of connecting, and media wasn't just background noise. It was starting to reorganize daily life. McLuhan looked at all this and said, hey, here's an idea. What if the real impact of media isn't in the content? So it's not in the shows you're watching on TV or the articles you're reading in the newspaper. Instead, he said, it's the medium itself, the thing that's providing you the pathway to consuming the information. That's what's influencing you. Now, at this point, you're probably not super convinced, but think about the television. You know, people watch sitcoms and soap operas and the evening news, but more importantly, at least according to McLuhan, they rearranged their living rooms and they restructured their evenings around the screen. Families now experienced world events together in real time. This medium, the television, was changing daily habits, attention spans, culture, and even politics. So when McLuhan said the medium is the message, what he meant was that every new medium that enters society, whether it's the television or our smartphones, it quietly reorganizes society, and not because of what's on it, but the nature of what it is. And to me, the most incredible thing about all of this is that McLuhan wrote about these things in the 60s, right? And this was decades before the internet or social media came about. He was a literature scholar, someone who spent years thinking about language and storytelling, who then zoomed out to see how the medium carrying those stories might actually be the thing with the most power. If medium theory basically says that the container shapes the content, perhaps we could think about it this way. A stage invites performance. The moment you step onto a stage, you feel like you should deliver something that you rehearsed, something worthy of an audience. Compare that to a social media feed. It invites speed. Quick takes, quick scrolls, quick judgments, quick reposts. But it doesn't stop there. The platforms we use aren't neutral backdrops. They're full of hidden design choices that push us in certain directions. Fonts affect whether something feels serious, playful, or disposable. Character limits chop our thoughts into bite-sized pieces, shaping how we argue or joke. Recommendation systems and algorithms decide what rises to the top, quietly telling us whose voices deserve attention. And analytics dashboards, those little graphs and heart-shaped counters, they become silent co-authors, steering us toward what gets clicks and away from what doesn't. So when we post, we're honestly not just expressing ourselves, we're collaborating with the medium itself. The container is writing alongside us. So let's test McLuhan's idea out. If, as he says, the medium really does shape the message, let's take a look at what I've divided to be the three main eras of DIY publishing. And I'll let you be the judge of whether their forms have been shaped by the platforms they use. Starting with zines. In the 70s, zines began as massive tools of resistance within punk and other countercultural movements. So zines are basically these small self-published magazines. They can be little booklets or leaflets, anything you can make by yourself with what you have. They allow people like you and me, individuals with perhaps no graphic design background, to bypass mainstream censorship and the gatekeeping of formal publishing to communicate our ideas and our social critiques. So where there was pushback by authorities, zines became an essential medium for sharing information, promoting protests, and fostering community. Around the 1980s, some zines had gained wider distribution channels and higher production values. But despite this, the DIY spirit stayed strong, and zines became iconic platforms known for confronting social issues and mobilizing the resistance. By the 90s, this tradition continued with movements such as Riot Girl, which used zines to challenge sexism and homophobia. But zines weren't just about what was written inside. There were poems, there were rants, there were music reviews, there were calls to action. But the whole form of the zine itself was part of the message. They were made with grainy images that had been photocopied and photocopied again, cut and paste collages, and they were hand stapled and distributed personally, and all of that shaped how they were read. So in this way, zines aren't just a container for content, they were the medium. They carried a message in their very existence. They said this was made by hand outside the system for a small circle of people who would understand what we're trying to say. The scarcity of copies, the smell of ink, even the uneven margins and the wonky stapling, that aesthetic was part of the voice. And because the medium had so much friction and so many checkpoints between being produced and read, it shaped the words of the author quite strictly. Fast forward to the boom of the dot-com and the early broadband era of the late 90s to the early 2000s. Suddenly, the internet is all in our homes, and you've got these platforms like LiveJournal, Blogger, and eventually WordPress. The vibe shifts. Now you have your own little corner of the web with permalinks, a comment section, maybe even a blog roll showing who's in your circle. It's not the cut and paste punk aesthetic anymore. It's paragraphs, hyperlinks, think pieces. You're narrating yourself publicly in real time and in long form. And the cultural context matters. This was all pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter, and the early 2000s optimism about the internet and the web being like a new democratic space where communities could gather and talk. It was all very reflective, discursive, and honestly, utopian. So, where zines encouraged the slow, deliberate curation of content, blog posts were built for faster paced community reflection and response. You could leave comments that would be seen and interacted with instantly, prompting you to engage more. And here again, we see the medium shaping its message. Things speed up even more here. We hit the 2010s with smartphones in every pocket and social media platforms competing for every second of your attention. Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram. The container shrinks, 140 characters, a square photo space. The vibe shifts towards punchlines. Everything has to be fast, it has to be quotable, it has to be memeable, it has to be aesthetically pleasing. Bonus points if you can hit all of those at once. And the platforms love it. You get likes, you get reposts, and visibility is awarded to content that suits the algorithm's preference. And because everything is public and shareable, context collapses. Nobody's writing to their friends anymore. We're just performing for the chance and the sake of going viral. Now more so than ever, the container shapes the style. We aren't just expressing ourselves when we post, we're collaborating with the platform's design. So if you line them up, zines demanded labor, so they felt curated. You had to really give your all into making this little thing, and each one was made with so much care. Blogs gave space, so they felt reflective. Microblogs demand speed, and so they tilt towards hot takes and performances. The container was never neutral. It has always shaped the message. Let's take a quick little break. We've come to the not sponsored portion of the episode where I tell you about a place or a thing that I've been enjoying, even though I'm really not being sponsored by them to say how much I like it. In today's episode, I am going to tell you about Family Mart and its creamy tom yum oden soup because I have been eating and drinking so much of it that I think my blood is like 40% tom yum soup at this point. But it's really so good, and I love it with the cheese heart-shaped tofu. I've been really enjoying that. It's a great late night snack for when you've been working all day and you really just want something warm to fill you up before you go to bed. Thank you, Family Mart, for your service in providing this delicious, delicious snack. And let's get back to the episode. Okay, fun fact. Did you know that in the 15th century, a single completed and bound manuscript could cost as much as an average court official's monthly salary? Because of this scarcity, knowledge was a private commodity that was only accessible to the very wealthy. And the very nature of this, having this painstakingly handwritten and hand copied manuscript, it reinforced a very strong sense of social hierarchy. And the economic barrier to access meant that literacy and the dissemination and dialogue of ideas was controlled by only a select powerful few. Intellectualism was considered to be something reserved for the elites of society. And I feel like this is honestly not too far off from where we are today. The internet was originally thought of as like something that would flatten hierarchies and make information readily accessible to anyone with a working internet connection. But I feel like if you just ask anyone on the internet today, we can tell you that it's an endless stream of gatekeepers. There's paywalls, there's subscription models, and there's monopolies restricting the flow of knowledge. Reliable, structured, and critically informed knowledge often remains behind barriers of money, privilege, or I know a guy who knows a guy networks. Knowledge and intellectualism once again risk being a luxury commodity rather than a common right. The irony is striking. Each step forward has promised to liberate knowledge from elite control, but each time, society has reproduced new hierarchies to contain and manage it. So back to these manuscripts that the monks were like painstakingly copying every day. They were really happy, probably, when Gutenberg's printing press came about around 1440. Compared to the 40 pages that could be copied by the hand of like a really hardworking scribe each day, this machine could produce up to 3,600 pages per workday. Productivity, baby! This capacity for mass production made books way more accessible, transforming them basically overnight into a profitable thing. But, beyond its economic impact, we can definitely say that the printing press fundamentally restructured the relationship between writers and readers. At the start, early printers emulated the style of manuscripts, but competitors and profit-driven motives quickly led to features prioritizing ease of use, like title pages and a table of contents, a uniform style of printing, and the verbatim repeatability of text, which created a single authoritative version of a work for the first time. Basically, what this means is that the standardization of text allowed for the identification of a single author. Because remember, before this, the monks and the church officials were copying entire books by hand. And because of the nature of human error, there was always a chance of every book ending up unique from the last. And so no standardization. But Gutenberg came in clutch for real. I think now it's kind of safe to say that a second communication-based revolution echoes that of the printing press. We have the widespread adoption of the internet, social media, and mobile technologies, and these have all shifted society's cultural balance back to being a more communal experience and away from the individualism of print culture. Just like the printing press dissolved the gatekeeping of literature by the church, the internet challenges the hierarchical model of content that dominated the print era. Now, anyone can be a content creator and advertiser. It doesn't take the mega corporations to sell you a product. Your friend can do it with a dazzling review and an affiliate code. I mean, this has implications of its own, but I digress. One of the most, if not the most, significant cultural shift of the reader-writer dynamic in the digital age is the emergence of the prosumer. This is a term coined by Alvin Toffler in 1980, which combines the words producer and consumer. So you get prosumer. This concept suggests a change from traditional models of mass production to a more personalized, participatory process that directly involves the consumer. And is not just an economic trend, it is the fundamental cultural shift in the dynamic. The rise of the prosumer is a direct result of inherent affordances of the digital medium. Unlike print, which leans towards one-way, one-to-many communication, digital media platforms are built on a many-to-many architecture that basically make it impossible for a consumer to not also be a producer. Think about it. Whether through writing a blog post, creating a piece of fan content, leaving a review, the passive reader, a product of print culture, is being replaced by an active, participatory prosumer. I know I've yapped an incredible amount already, but allow me to burrow into this crevice a little bit more. Let's talk about the social media ecosystem and how it has altered the writer reader dynamic. Let's get the obvious out of the way. Reader voices are very much amplified through the internet and its online communities. Now we have forums and platforms like Goodreads, which offer spaces for readers to engage directly with authors. They can ask questions, they can give feedback and reviews, and this direct engagement leads to a collaborative and kind of an intimate relationship between writers and their audiences. This feedback loop creates a paradoxical situation, in my opinion. On one hand, it encourages creative synergizing that can inspire really good work. Authors are driven by their audience's engagement and take their opinions seriously about what kind of writing they want to see. The democratization of the written word also allows for previously underrepresented voices to be heard, which leads to a more diverse and inclusive literary landscape. But, on the other hand, the constant feedback can also be overwhelming for authors and creates pressure to cater to market demands, potentially diluting the originality of their work. Take The Hunger Games as a series, for example. The first book, iconic. The trilogy, okay, not bad. A young adult dystopian classic. But many readers have expressed frustration at the series author, Suzanne Collins, for turning out subsequent prequels at lightning speed, seemingly sacrificing the plot and quality of writing. This duality highlights an interesting key feature of this dynamic between writers and their readers. The same technology that empowers and liberates also has the potential to constrain and homogenize. And I think that's the key difference between digital text and printed works, isn't it? While subject to interpretation, the printed book is a fixed object that is both literally and figuratively bound by its physical form. It can't be altered, it can't be added to. You'd have to create a whole new version of it for that. Digital texts, however, more and more, are fluid and can be updated, repurposed, remixed, edited. And so, in this sense, they're no longer a noun, but a verb, an ongoing collaborative process. We've talked about a lot in this episode. We walked through medium theory, a little bit about McLuhan, the man who thought it into existence. I talked about the different eras of DIY publishing and how each platform or method shaped the kind of message that came from it, which further emphasizes McLuhan's theory. And then I talked about cultural shifts in the writer-reader dynamic throughout the two biggest democratizations of content, the printing press and the internet. Now, while today's episode has been centered very heavily on medium theory, I do want to acknowledge its limitations. Critics of medium theory argue that it neglects other factors that influence communication, like content, style, and of course, existing cultural context. A significant counterpoint argues that human action and social context shape the design and use of technology, rather than the tech itself. I think this is a good time to bring up reader response theory, which is pioneered by theorists like Wolfgang Iser and Stanley Fish. These came up also in the 60s and 70s, and they basically flipped McLuhan's theory on its head. This theory, reader response theory, says that a text lacks inherent meaning until it is co-constructed in the transaction between the text and its reader, who fills the gaps using their own imagination, their own experiences, and their cultural conventions. This theory explicitly rejects the notion of a single fixed meaning determined by an authority's intent. It's important to note that in the age of print, filling the gaps was a private internal act. A reader's interpretation remained largely in their own mind, unless they decided to share it through formal channels like a book club or a letter to a publisher. But in the digital age, platforms like blogs, social media, and online forums, they allow readers to immediately and publicly share their interpretations, discuss contradictions, and collectively fill the gaps through comments, reviews, and collaborative projects. The collective meaning making that was once a theoretical concept is now very much a lived reality. So ultimately, I think that medium theory stays relevant because of how it conveys that the tools we use to communicate don't just carry messages, they co-author or even become the message. This shift has made it clear that the future of authorship and readership is a deeply intertwined and co-creative process, and the lines between producer and consumer are erased, and the meaning of a text is constantly negotiated by the community that engages with it. Of course, we have to acknowledge this dynamic is still in its infancy. The implications of this will continue to evolve as technology and culture shape one another. In a way, McLuhan's idea has never been more relevant, but not without its paradoxes. The same medium that fosters community and empowers us to challenge social stigmas can also lead to social isolation and the creation of echo chambers. The legacy of medium theory lies in its part in building the framework for understanding this complex, ongoing negotiation between technology and humanity, showing that our communication tools are not just neutral vessels, but active participants in the ever evolving, ever ongoing project of creating our global and community cultures. I guess I'd like to end this by inviting us to just take a second to think of every platform we use as less like a blank page and more like a co author. From zines to blogs to tweets to newsletters, we've seen that the tools are never neutral and they're part of the story we tell. So the next time you're about to post something, just think, how can I leverage this platform and make it my friend and use it to get the most out of what I want to say? I'm Aislinn, and this was Season 1, Episode 1 of the Theory and Tangents podcast. Thank you for letting me keep you company for a little while. Talk soon!